I'll never forget the night my world fell apart. I wasn't supposed to be home that late. I walked in tired, still in my work clothes, expecting nothing more than a quick hello and maybe a leftover meal. But the second I stepped through the door, I felt it. That strange stillness, the kind that makes your stomach twist before your brain even catches up. Upstairs, I heard laughter. Not the kind that belongs to a mother and her daughter's boyfriend, but something different. Something that made my skin crawl. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat, but I forced my legs to move. One step, then another, until I opened the door. And there they were. My boyfriend. My mother. Together. His face pale with shock, hers calm, almost amused, like she enjoyed watching my heart crack into pieces. In that moment, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just froze. And then I promised myself one thing. If they chose desire over loyalty, then I would choose revenge over mercy. Before I tell you how I did it, let me ask you something. Have you ever been betrayed so deeply it felt like the ground disappeared beneath you? By someone you trusted more than anyone else? That's where I was. And it almost broke me. Almost. But here's the truth. Betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. Sometimes it's the beginning of a much darker, much more satisfying one. If you've ever dreamed of seeing someone who wronged you get exactly what they deserve, stay with me. Because this is one of the most cathartic, shocking revenge stories you'll ever hear. And if you believe loyalty matters, if you believe betrayal should never go unpunished, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and let's dive into how I turned heartbreak into payback. If you had asked me a year ago what my life looked like, I would have smiled and told you I was finally where I wanted to be. I was 24. Not a teenager fumbling through high school crushes. Not a college kid scrambling to figure out who I was. I was, for the first time, a woman standing on my own 2 feet. I had just started my career as a junior graphic designer at a small marketing firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous. My desk was crammed between a buzzing copy machine and the office plant that always smelled faintly of mildew. But it was mine. My projects, my deadlines, my paycheck. Independence. I rented a small apartment on the 2nd floor of an old brick building. It had squeaky floors and a radiator that clanked like it was haunted. But when I came home, turned the key and stepped inside, I felt proud. I was building a life, slowly but surely. And the brightest part of that life? Ethan. Ethan and I met in the most ordinary, almost cliché way. A mutual friend had dragged me to a birthday party I didn't want to attend. I remember standing awkwardly near the snack table, scrolling through my phone to avoid eye contact, when suddenly this tall guy with dark hair and warm hazel eyes appeared beside me. "You know, you look like you're planning an escape," he said, smirking. I laughed, genuinely laughed. And from that moment he had me. Ethan wasn't flashy. He wasn't the kind of guy who lit up a room with loud jokes or demanded all the attention. He was the opposite. Grounded. Attentive. The kind of person who remembered the tiniest details. Like how I preferred tea over coffee, or that I hated when people interrupted me mid-sentence. 3 years later, he had become my safe place. My constant. He'd pick me up from late nights at the office with takeout in hand. He'd leave little notes in my lunch bag. He'd brush the hair out of my eyes when I was too tired to move it myself. Of course, we had arguments. Everyone does, but I always believed he was my person. I used to picture us in the future, sharing a house, maybe even kids. I thought he was the one I'd build my forever with. And that belief, that blind, hopeful belief, would be the very thing that almost destroyed me. To really understand what happened, you need to know about my mother, Caroline. Caroline was the kind of woman who made people stare. Even at 45, she carried herself like she belonged on the cover of a magazine. Perfectly styled hair, carefully chosen clothes that somehow looked effortless but clearly weren't. She had this aura, magnetic, commanding, like she walked into a room and expected the world to notice. And usually it did. Growing up, I lived in her shadow. People constantly told me, "You look just like your mother, just wait until you're her age." They thought it was a compliment, but to me it always felt like pressure. Caroline was flawless, or at least she made herself appear that way, and I was just me. Ordinary. Our relationship was complicated. She wasn't the warm, nurturing mom you see in TV shows. She was more like a coach, or worse, a critic. Always quick to point out how I could do better, how I could be smarter, thinner, more charming. If I brought home a B+ on a test, she'd smile and say, "That's good, but I know you could have gotten an A." Don't get me wrong, she wasn't cruel. She provided for me. She made sure I had what I needed. But affection? Genuine closeness? That wasn't Caroline's language. She thrived on admiration, on being the star. And deep down, I think she struggled when she wasn't the center of attention. One of the few constants in our family life was Sunday dinner. Every week, I'd go back to my parents' house, usually bringing Ethan with me. My dad traveled constantly for work, so it was mostly the three of us, me, Ethan, and Mom. The dinners were comfortable in their own way. Mom cooked her signature roast chicken, the one dish she always bragged about perfecting. We'd drink a little wine, laugh about trivial things, and for a while, I felt like maybe we were normal. At first, I loved how much Mom adored Ethan. She'd light up when he walked in, rushing to greet him with a hug. She'd ask him about work, compliment his shirt, serve him extra portions at dinner. I thought she was just being maternal, friendly, happy that I'd found a good guy. But as time went on, something about the way she looked at him made me uneasy. Too much warmth in her smile. Too much lingering in her touch when she passed him a dish. Too much laughter at his jokes, the kind of laughter that felt rehearsed. I brushed it off. She was my mom. What reason would I have to think anything beyond that? Looking back now, I can see the red flags waving, screaming for my attention. There was the time we were clearing the table, and I caught her hand resting just a little too long on his shoulder. My stomach tightened, but I told myself I was imagining it. Or the time Ethan and I were running late, and when we finally arrived, Mom teased, "You're lucky I didn't steal him away while I was waiting." She said it with a laugh, like a joke, but something in her eyes made me uneasy. And then there was the Christmas dinner. I'd stepped out to take a phone call, and when I came back, I found them sitting close, whispering about something. They jumped apart the moment I entered. I asked what was so funny, and Mom quickly said, "Oh, nothing important." Ethan avoided my eyes. I laughed it off, forced myself not to read too much into it. That's what we do, right? We gaslight ourselves because the alternative is too painful to face. After all, she was my mother. He was my boyfriend. Two of the people I trusted most in the world. What possible reason would I have to suspect betrayal? The truth is, I wanted to believe in them. I wanted to believe that the life I was building, my career, my independence, my relationship, was solid. I wanted to feel like I'd finally escaped the shadow of my mother and was creating something of my own. So I ignored the unease in my gut. I silenced the voice in my head that whispered, "Something's wrong." I told myself, "You're overthinking. You're jealous. You're paranoid." And for a while that worked. For a while, I believed everything was fine. But deep down, I think I knew. I think some part of me always knew. Because betrayal like that doesn't happen overnight. It creeps in slowly, like a leak in the ceiling. At first, it's just a stain you hardly notice. But left unchecked, it grows, it spreads, until one day the whole roof caves in. And when my roof caved in, it wasn't just water and wood and plaster. It was my heart, my trust, my family. And it all started here, with the girl who thought she had everything, when really, she had no idea how close she was to losing it all. The night I found them is the night the word home stopped meaning what it used to. I can still feel the way the porch light shook under my palm as I reached for the key, the way the air smelled like rain and lemon cleanser, and the faint, familiar scent of my mother's perfume. It was the sort of ordinary evening that makes ordinary betrayals possible, because nothing dramatic had happened to prepare me. That's what made it worse. The betrayal had the softest possible entrance. I'd been at the office late. The kind of late where your inbox looks less like tasks and more like small explosions you have to step around. I remember closing my laptop, rubbing my eyes, and thinking about nothing important. Ethan had texted earlier that he'd swing by Mom's to fix that stupid leak. It was a sweet-sounding plan. It was domestic. It sounded for a moment like a whole life. Him helping out, me coming over later for Sunday leftovers, small and safe. So when I pulled into the drive, when I walked up the familiar steps and opened the front door, what I expected was the cozy chaos of my mother's apartment. Plates in the sink, a blanket tossed over the armchair, the TV murmuring some channel I didn't care about. What I felt instead was a silence so thick it had weight. It pressed against my chest before I even climbed the stairs. There was a sound upstairs. Not loud, not urgent. A soft, clipped laugh and another voice answering. The way their voices fit together in that instant made something like ice trace the length of my spine. It was a sound I knew. The easy laughter of people who were comfortable with each other, who let sentences slide into half-formed jokes. But context matters. Here, in my parents' home, it was wrong in a way that made my stomach drop. My hands were steady enough to take the steps, but there was a numbness in my feet, like I was walking in someone else's shoes. Each stair creaked out a countdown. 1, 2, 3. The hallway smelled like my childhood, polish and lemon and the faint tang of my mother's perfume, and it felt alien and intimate all at once. I paused outside the bedroom door because some small, rational part of me wanted to knock. Instead, my hand pushed it open. They were close. Not shouting, not dramatic. Just close in the way adults who had crossed some line can be. Head bent toward head, voices low, the room arranged around them like a private world. A blanket lay half-folded on the bed. A glass with lipstick marks glinted on the nightstand. Clothes were not strewn in any obscene pile, but their proximity said everything I needed to know. Time did something odd then. It slowed and sharpened. The ceiling's texture, the grain of the wooden floor, the tiny rip in the rug by the bedside became painfully clear. Ethan's face went from casual to stunned the second his eyes hit me. He looked like someone who had been caught mid-gesture, hand frozen. My mother looked up more slowly, and I remember that look as if it were carved, cool, composed, almost bored. No panic, no shame, just a small, almost indulgent smile, like someone watching a trick succeed. "You should knock, sweetheart," she said. Her voice had the same flat politeness she used when she corrected my grammar. The irony of that sentence ricocheted through me and struck bone. Ethan tried to speak, but his words came out in ragged little pieces. I didn't," he fumbled, eyes pleading in a way that made me want to close them. He looked small and ridiculous in that moment, a child caught in an act far beyond his capacity to explain. There was guilt there, visceral and immediate, but also cowardice, the kind that mutters apologies instead of taking responsibility. My knees nearly gave out. I gripped the doorframe because the floor felt unsteady, as if the whole house had been lifted a little and set down wrong. My throat closed. I could feel the world tilting. The house spun faintly like a room on a carousel. Breath snagged, then came in sharp, hot pulls. My hands trembled so violently my phone buzzed in my pocket and then slipped out and hit the floor. The sound was obscene in its ordinariness. "What is this?" My voice came out thin, small, a noise more like a child's than an accusation. I tried to make it sharper, more like the blade I wanted it to be, but it came out raw, and raw is vulnerable. My mother smoothed the blanket around her knees and said, with maddening calm, "We were talking. Is that so criminal?" Her gaze slid over me like I was a bit of lint. There was no panic to soften her. There was an almost academic curiosity, as if she were enjoying a case study. "Talking," I repeated. The word tasted absurd in my mouth. My memory filled with the small images that, only now, rearranged themselves into a pattern. The way her hand had rested on his shoulder that Christmas, the private smiles, the whispered jokes in the kitchen when I stepped out. Those moments that I had let explain themselves away now had the clarity of a photograph. Ethan's apology dissolved into excuses. Loneliness, a moment of weakness, the muddled idea that things were complicated. He looked like someone trying to hold together a paper boat in a storm. I wanted to tear into him, to demand how he could betray me with the woman who raised me, to ask how he could make the thing I trusted most into a lie. But my voice stayed small. My body decided to leave me no force for fury. I remember sitting down because the room was spinning. I remember trying to find air. I remember thinking I was watching myself from outside. This surrealistic sensation, like I had walked into some film and hadn't been told my lines. For a brief, jagged second, I felt something like amusement at the absurdity of it all. Then the amusement faded into the hot recognition of humiliation. The fallout was immediate in its psychological violence. Over the next hours and days, ordinary things that had been routine became treacherous. I drove home and couldn't keep my hands from shaking as I held the steering wheel. The city looked different. Colors drolled and bled into each other. I replayed those few seconds on a loop. The coolness of my mother's smile, Ethan's helpless gape, the glass on the nightstand catching the lamplight like a witness. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought me dreams that were less scenes than sensations, the touch of betrayal as a physical thing, a texture under my fingers. In the daylight, I moved through tasks as if draped in cotton wadding. At work I smiled when polite coworkers asked if I had a good weekend, as if smiling could stitch me back together. But the seams showed. My designs were flat, my colors muddled. My boss asked if I needed time off. I said no because I could not quite admit to myself what had happened. I tried to talk to Ethan. Standing in my tiny kitchen, with a mug I could not finish, I pressed the point as calmly as I could. "Why?" The question was ridiculous and giant all at once. His eyes filled with the kind of shame I would have respected if it had been honest. Instead, shame mingled with something thinner. The inability to be entirely present for the consequence of his choice. "I was stupid," he said. "I don't know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean," his voice trailed. He spoke like someone reading words off a script he didn't own. He apologized, but the apology had no weight. It sounded like a reflex, a tool to be used when convenient. My mother's reactions were different. She sent me messages the way a corporate PR person crafts a press release. "I'm sorry you feel hurt. That was never my intention." Then later, "You will understand eventually." Her words had the polish of someone who'd rehearsed regret as a performance. There was no tremor behind them, no real ownership. It made rage bloom in me, an animal sensation, hot and bright. How dare she reduce my pain to an inconvenience? Friends tried to be anchors. Some reached out with the clumsy earnestness of people who meant well, but couldn't imagine the depth of betrayal. One friend offered her couch. Another took me to coffee and chattered like a squirrel trying to fill silence. There were those who stepped back, too. The ones who didn't know how to hold the space for my pain without letting it touch their own lives. I felt some of them recoil, almost as if shame were contagious, and distracted them. And then there was the humiliation, that treacherous, particular soreness that stems from feeling exposed. I began to imagine what people would think if they knew. I pictured mutual friends at brunch, blinking, exchanging awkward glances. I imagined conversations I wasn't part of, the soft, idle speculation that plants a rumor and lets it grow. The humiliation stung not just because of the act, but because of what it meant for my identity. I had been someone's partner, someone's daughter, and somehow I had become disposable. Grief, too, arrived in waves. Not a single sob, but a cumulative erosion. I grieved the future I had pictured with Ethan, the small, bright things I had taken for granted. I grieved the version of my mother I had hoped for. One who loved me unquestionably, who would stand as shelter. Those losses were not theatrical. They were the mean, quiet kind that fill your days with small, dull aches. Some nights the grief felt like a physical shadow that leaned over me. Other nights it woke me like a siren. The anger had a different voice. Quick, hot, a pressure under my skin that made my hands clench. I wanted retribution, but not just for anger's sake. I wanted recognition. I wanted the world to know that what they had done carried consequences. And in the midst of all that, between the dry, shocked moments and the boiling shame, that tiny ember of a different feeling was born. It wasn't yet strategy. It wasn't even courage. It was the bare thought that sparked and refused to be snuffed. If they thought I'd just disappear, they're wrong. It was a simple, stubborn idea, but it felt like a lifeline. I replayed it to myself in small moments, while washing dishes, while staring out the window at traffic, while trying to coax sleep from my bones. The thought warmed and grew, a quiet threat that steadied me more than any apology ever could. They had chosen each other over me. I would not choose oblivion. That was the day the landscape of my life shifted. The ground under me had cracked, and between the fissures something else could grow. It would be slow. It would be careful. But it would also be deliberate. The betrayal had taken a lot. It would not take everything. For a long time after that night, I teetered between two dangerous temptations. To collapse into an endless ache and let time do whatever it does, or to turn that ache into something else, into a plan, into action. Both felt justified. Both felt necessary. The part of me that wanted to heal whispered, "Take care of yourself. Sleep. Talk to friends. Try to forgive and move on." The part that wanted to strike back was louder. "They stole from you. They deserve a response. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be protected from ever being treated like that again." There is no poetic clarity in those days. The decision to move toward revenge didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It was small choices added together. Refusing to call them, denying myself the relief of a dramatic confrontation, and instead channeling the energy that grief had given me into cold, patient thinking. Anger that had once burned uncontrolled now sharpened into focus. Pain became the light I used to map a route. I would grieve, yes, but I would also plan. I started with inventory. Pretending to be rational helped. It kept me from fraying. I made lists the way I used to make design briefs. Clear, prioritized, actionable. What did I have? What did they have? What could be used and what could not? The first list felt like a lifeline. Truth, time, access to their routines, patience. The second list, their vulnerabilities, was longer than I wanted it to be. Ethan, I realized, was not an anchor of stability. He had charm, yes, but beneath the easy smile there was a man who had never really been tested. His professional life was a thread that could be frayed. He worked at a small firm where reputation mattered, where flippant behavior could look like incompetence when framed correctly. He had debts he never talked about at dinner, loans that forced him to take odd freelance gigs, a credit history he quietly worried about. People who depend on the appearance of control are brittle when that appearance cracks. My mother, Caroline, was a different puzzle. Her armor was glossy and social. Her currency was admiration and influence. She curated her life like a gallery, and everyone in her orbit was a patron. She loved being admired more than she loved almost anything else. She cultivated friends who called her for recipes and compliments, and neighbors who complimented her garden and wardrobe. To wound her, I would not need to attack her privacy so much as collapse her stage. Strip away the audience and she would be raw. I recorded what I knew like a journalist because lovers of truth need the discipline of fact. I began compiling names, dates, patterns. Where Ethan ate lunch. Which coworkers found him difficult. The clients who had complained quietly. For my mother, I noted the social calendars, bridge nights, book clubs, neighborhood committees. I followed conversations and patterns until a map emerged. Times, places, small habits that could be nudged into consequence. Collecting information became a ritual. I opened a new file on my laptop and named it simply, Truth. The title felt both childish and satisfying. In it I cataloged texts I had saved on the first night, the awkward messages, the non-apology, "I'm sorry you feel that way" notes. I also dug deeper. Old emails, public posts, the breadcrumbs people leave by mistake. I learned that Ethan had been careless with his phone, a device that, in our era, is both a weapon and a confession booth. He'd replied to messages in the late hours and deleted threads casually. That sloppiness would be useful. With my mother, subtlety mattered more. She was practiced at repairing appearances. She would never admit anything that required moral accounting. But pride is brittle, and the brittle thing I planned to chip was her reputation. I made lists of neighbors who had made snide remarks over the years. I made notes of past petty jealousies. Vanity can be pried open by embarrassment. Social currency can be devalued by rumor that's tethered to truth. There is a moral calculus in plans like these that I wrestled with daily. I told myself I was not embarking on blind cruelty. I wasn't looking for revenge's sake. I wanted proportion. I wanted them to face the consequences of a choice that shredded a life. Justice, in that private sense, felt like a rightful correction. If I framed my actions as a necessary restoration of balance, it was easier to sleep at night. Mostly, my methods had to be clean. I refused to stoop to gossip or fabrications. No lies, only truth, aligned and presented in a way that could not be brushed away as the rantings of a hurt person. That standard kept me honest and effective. If I had wanted to ruin them with fiction, I could have smeared names and sown chaos in 1,000 messy ways. Instead, I chose surgery over arson. The first practical step was lowering their guard. Anger is transparent, calm is invisible. If I wanted access to their patterns, to the receipts, the messages, the small confessions they made believing no one was paying attention, I needed them to think the incident had only wounded me into retreat. So I performed the role of someone who was tired of drama. I sent messages that read like a slow withdrawal. To Ethan, "I need time." To my mother, "We'll talk later." Both messages were true in their own way. I needed time, but I needed it to be time spent gathering, not mending. There's something almost theatrical about pretending to be forgiving. I practiced neutral tones in the mirror and smoothed my face into the soft deflection they expected. When Ethan called, I let the phone ring a few times and then answered with a voice that said, "I'm fragile," even as my mind cataloged his words. He tried to catch at me. I let the thread stay taut without snapping. My restraint became a tool. Small deceptions are like fishing lines. You don't see the hook until you're already near the edge. I cultivated moments that seemed casual, dropping by with a casserole for no reason, smiling politely at weekend gatherings, responding to invitations with the kind of laconic grace that suggested I was moving on. The performance calmed them, and calm breeds sloppiness. They let their guard down in ways that made evidence collection possible. Collecting evidence was less glamorous than I imagined. It involved patience and attention to tiny things. Screenshots, timestamps, GPS logs, receipts, and inconsistent stories. I learned how to archive texts so they could be altered. I made audio notes of conversations where possible, always careful to stay within legal and moral boundaries I set for myself. No illegal wiretapping, no entrapment. That discipline gave me confidence. If I was going to bring them down, I wanted the structure of truth to support every accusation. There were nights when the work felt like a betrayal of my former self. Once, while scrolling through messages, I felt a sudden wave of disgust, not at them, but at what I had become, somebody who stored and circled evidence like a lawyer building a case. I made myself a ritual cup of tea and reminded myself of why I was doing it. The reminders were small and practical. I wanted to remove their ability to hurt me again. I wanted them to see the consequences of their choices. I wanted to rebuild a life not shadowed by what they had done. I also used friends tactically, not by duping them, but by recognizing who could be trusted with what information. One friend, a calm, pragmatic woman who had always been skeptical of my mother's polished persona, became an invaluable sounding board. She helped me see where gossip might stick and where it would shatter. Another acquaintance, a former colleague of Ethan's, offered context about workplace politics that I could never have imagined. I didn't recruit allies to attack. I asked for perspective, small favors, confirmations that would strengthen my case when the time came. As my file fattened, I turned to mapping consequences. Each vulnerable point I found translated into a lever I could pull. If Ethan valued his career, then truth that undermined his integrity would puncture his standing. If my mother clung to her social image, then public knowledge of what she had done would strip her of the applause she relied upon. The levers had to be used in a precise sequence, so one blow would not simply be absorbed or spun into a story of victimhood. Timing was everything, so I created a plan of attack, surgical, staged, and relentless. The stages were simple when written down: gather indisputable evidence, expose in a controlled public setting where denial would be messy, press where it would hurt most, at work, at social gatherings, and then, if needed, apply pressure until they were forced to confront what they had done. Step 1. Steady accumulation of proof. Screenshots of messages, bank transaction records hinting at secret meetings, a series of timestamps that proved they had been together at odd hours. I stored everything redundantly on encrypted drives. I printed copies and stored them in a safe place. Paper has a permanence that files sometimes lack. I learned to move like someone building a case, not someone raving into the wind. Step 2. Secure corroboration. I identified people who might have seen more than they admitted. A neighbor who often watched my mother's comings and goings. Ethan's late-night barista who'd notice odd hours. I spoke to them slowly, never accusing, only asking whether they noticed anything out of the ordinary. Those conversations became threads I could pull later. Step 3. Stage a public reveal that could not be easily spun. Not a viral social media rant. Those are messy and can rebound. Instead, a meeting where the people whose opinions mattered most to each of them would be present. Family members, work supervisors, community leaders. I wanted their world to crack where it counted. Step 4. The professional consequences. For Ethan, I planned to present documented inconsistencies to his workplace in a context that made it clear his judgment was compromised. For someone whose reputation was currency, a blow to credibility is often a blow to livelihood. For my mother, the social fallout would be orchestrated through quiet conversations that isolated her. Letters of complaint, whispered questions at the bridge club, polite but distancing phone calls. Throughout all of this, I protected myself. I kept records of my own actions. I made sure everything I did could be explained as reasonable steps taken by a person wronged. There was a legal and moral scaffolding to my plan that kept me from slipping into the kind of chaos that makes you look like the villain. There were moments when doubt rose, when the woman I used to be, soft, eager to forgive, terrified of confrontation, whispered that I should stop. I listened to her, and then I told her gently that this was not cruelty. This was prevention. I reminded myself that people who break trust must answer for it, because otherwise they will do it again. By the time the plan had flesh on its bones, the ember of revenge had become a steady, controlled flame. I woke up in the mornings with a list of small tasks. Consolidate a file, follow up with a source, rehearse a conversation. Each crossed-off item was a small reclaiming of power. The humiliation that had once felt like a weight began to feel like propellant. When the day to initiate the first phase rolled closer, my hands did not shake like they had the night I opened that door. I felt strangely calm, not healed but focused. The decision had been made, the map drawn. I had chosen to turn pain into action, betrayal into a dossier, shame into a tool for justice. If they thought I'd disappear, they were wrong. The sentence no longer felt like a promise made in the dark. It felt like a strategy, and I was ready to execute it. The hardest part of planning revenge is knowing when to stop waiting and start acting. I'd rehearsed scenarios until they were muscle memory. I'd built my case until it felt irrefutable. And when the calendar date I'd circled finally arrived, I felt a curious calm, a steady pressure behind my ribs that felt like readiness more than rage. I chose the day for the first move with purpose. Dad was home. He'd agreed weeks earlier to come back for a family dinner and stay the weekend. He was the person whose opinion had always mattered most to all of us, the silent balance to my mother's performative shine. If anyone could see through Caroline's polished performances, it would be him. I wanted truth to meet the person who would most likely make it real. The scene was ordinary enough on the surface. My father's arrival brought a small bustle. A vase straightened, a welcome note on the mantel, the hum of expectation. Caroline was brighter than usual, flitting between preparations and phone calls. Ethan showed up on time, fidgeting in his jacket, trying to look composed around my father like a man who wanted to be liked and was practiced at being agreeable. I walked in carrying a casserole, a prop I had used before, nothing alarming, and smiled in a way I had practiced until it felt automatic. Step 1, exposure, had to be surgical. I didn't want shouting or viral rants. I wanted a quiet inevitability, where denial would be impossible. So I created a moment where truth had nowhere to hide. Dinner was set for early evening. My extended family would trickle in later. For now it was just the four of us in the living room, wine glasses catching the late sun. I had placed a neatly bound folder on the coffee table, right where anyone could see it. No fanfare, just presence. My father sank into an armchair and picked up the folder before anyone could stop him. He frowned at the cover, my handwriting, truth, and opened it. There, in plain, organized stacks, were the things I had collected: dated texts, screenshots with timestamps, bank receipts that corroborated odd meetings, and a timeline I had constructed that left little room for reinterpretation. I'd included short, annotated notes that connected the dots politely, almost clinically. It was the kind of document a court would respect, and a gossip column couldn't spin into fiction. My mother's face shifted as she read. She went from composed to pale in a breath. Ethan's jaw tightened. My father read on, his expression unreadable. The room was small and hot with the weight of attention. "I thought you said you'd give me time," Ethan whispered, then louder. "What is this?" My voice was steady. "It's the truth," I said. "I thought you should see it for yourself before anyone else gets a say." Caroline's first reflex was to smirk, a tiny curl at the corner of her mouth that had always been her default armor. Then she tried the classic move, minimization. "This is childish," she said. "Accusations from a hurt woman." I let my father speak. He closed the folder slowly, looked at both of them, and said with that calm he always carried, "I don't enjoy being surprised by the people I raised." His disappointment landed like a physical blow. Caroline's composed mask cracked for a second. She started with the rehearsed lines. "I never meant to hurt you." But the words felt thin in that room. That first domino fell exactly as I'd planned. My father asked questions, sharp, practical ones about dates, times, explanations, and they faltered. There was no coherent alternative narrative that could stand next to the paper trail I'd laid out. The exposure wasn't loud. It was devastating because it was incontrovertible, and it was witnessed by someone whose voice meant something. But one exposure is not collapse. People can spin. They can cry, they can make themselves victims, and the public will often believe the performance. So while the family fallout brewed, I set the second stage in motion: professional consequences. Ethan's job was built on trust and competence. I had learned from conversations and a few well-placed confidences that his supervisor valued reliability above all. So I prepared a file for human resources, not the kind of file that screams vendetta, but the kind that shows patterns, inconsistent statements, missed meetings, behavior that undermined team cohesion. I included carefully redacted portions of messages and documented dates when Ethan's actions had affected clients. I asked a former colleague, someone who had once admired Ethan but had quietly observed his slide, to look at the material and corroborate instances where Ethan's behavior had put projects at risk. I delivered the packet in person to HR a few days after the family dinner. I did not dramatize the moment. I handed the envelope to a woman who took her role seriously, someone who had no reason to be personally invested in my family's drama. "This is all documented," I told her calmly. "I'm not here to ruin a career for revenge. I'm here because judgment and integrity matter in a workplace." She read, nodded, and promised an investigation. The fallout at work was not an immediate explosion. It was the subtle unspooling of credibility. Meetings were rearranged. A project I'd known Ethan to lead was reassigned temporarily, and whispers followed him down the corridor. I watched the slow erosion of his professional face, the polite nods that turned into cold avoidance, invitations to contribute at team meetings that stopped arriving. The cruelty of it was sharp. The loss of respect is often more damning than public shaming. People who once deferred to him now questioned his decisions. Clients asked for reassurances. Rumors about his reliability grew like mold in a damp room, unseen at first but impossible to ignore once it spread. While Ethan's career faltered, my mother's social world began to crumble in a different way. People like Caroline don't endure the loss of admiration lightly. Her friends called with brittle concern, not because they believed the worst, but because the new narrative demanded distance until things made sense. I left copies of certain messages, the ones where she'd admitted things casually, where pride crept into confession, with neighbors who had always loved drama and truth in equal measure. I didn't push. I merely offered gentle facts, and human curiosity did the rest. At the bridge club, the gentle nods became stiff. Invitations for coffee dried up. The woman who used to be asked for decorating tips suddenly found herself on the outside of conversations. It was a measured exile, surgical in its quietness. No one had to say she was ostracized. The small, consistent changes told the story better. Fewer calls, fewer joint outings, the subtle sidelong looks when she entered a room. Everything unfolded like a well-executed play. Not because I had the heart of a puppeteer, but because timing and truth are potent together. I watched from a distance as the people who'd once bolstered my mother's pride shifted their allegiance, or at least their attention. The humiliation was not humiliating in the sensational sense. It was the erosion of applause, the removal of mirrors that made her feel whole. When both professional and social pressures had begun to tighten their grip, I prepared for the final act, the confrontation that would reclaim my voice. I wasn't interested in melodrama. I wanted a moment of clarity where the three of us, my father included, would stand in a room and name the damage out loud. I suggested a meeting, neutrally, formally, under the guise of "we need to talk." My father agreed to be there. My mother arrived with a face that had learned to smolder with wounded dignity. Ethan looked like a man who had aged in a week. I sat across from them. The table between us felt like the edge of a stage. When I spoke, my voice wasn't elevated by fury. It was crisp and deliberate. "You made a choice," I said. "You chose to place your desires ahead of the people who trusted you. You chose to break a home. You made decisions that hurt me deeply." My mother opened her mouth to deflect, to use the old strategies of charm and reframe. But my father, who had watched the folder and listened to HR make calls, cut her off with a single sentence that felt like verdict rather than counsel. "You were not thinking of anyone but yourself, Caroline." His voice was steady, a punishment in its tranquility. Ethan's eyes met mine, and for a second I looked at the man I had loved and recognized both him and the gap he had left. He spoke in a small, regretful tone that had no defense left. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were the same as before, but now they hit against consequences. They sounded like a plea that had nowhere to land. I laid out the final detail, the quiet rebuke that removed their last safe space. I told them about the HR investigation, about the social distancing that had started at the Bridge Club, about the way people had begun to look at them with new eyes. I did not gloat. I did not scream. I stated facts. Facts are heavier than accusations because they make denial feel childish. Caroline's face crumpled in a way I had never seen. For a moment, she looked like the younger woman my grandmother used to show in photographs. Less armor, more bone. The humility was not graceful. It was raw and somehow deserved. Ethan's shoulders sagged as if a weight had found him after he'd been running for a long time. When it was over, the room felt quieter than it had the night I first found them. Not because everything had been fixed, things were irreparably different, but because the illusion was gone. My power had returned in a form I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't triumph so much as reclamation. As I left the house that night, I felt the odd mix of relief and sorrow that comes after you have righted something with a heavy hand. The revenge had worked, in the sense that the structures that allowed their betrayal to flourish were softened. But the deeper thing I took was the reclamation of my voice. I had been made small. I had become deliberate. I had forced the truth into light, and in that light, I could finally see the edges of the life I wanted to build. One without people who would trade me for convenience. I didn't dance on anyone's ruin. I didn't gloat. I simply watched as the consequences I had set in motion unfolded, and in watching, I felt the slow, steady stitch of repair begin. They were stunned. They were humiliated. They had to face what they'd done, and that, for me, was enough. When the dust finally settled, I felt something I hadn't in months: silence inside my own head. Not the suffocating silence that used to crush me after that night, not the silence of disbelief, of a heart torn open and left raw, but the silence that comes after a storm when the wind finally dies down. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was dragging a shadow behind me. I felt free. It wasn't a fireworks kind of victory. Nobody handed me a medal. There was no cinematic finale where the villains collapsed to their knees and begged for forgiveness. The satisfaction was quieter, deeper, more private. It was knowing that the scales had been balanced, that the people who had underestimated me, who thought they could trample my loyalty and still walk tall, were finally standing in the wreckage of their own choices. And me, I wasn't broken anymore. I was stronger than I'd ever been. For a long time, I thought betrayal was something you never came back from. I thought it would leave me brittle, suspicious of everyone, unable to trust again. But as the weeks passed, I realized something else entirely. Betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had rebirthed me. It forced me to stop being the girl who lived for other people's approval and become the woman who could stand on her own, with her head held high, knowing she had carved her own justice when no one else would. That's the strange paradox of betrayal. It's brutal, yes. It shakes the ground beneath you and makes you question your worth, your judgment, even your sanity. But once the fire cools, once you've walked through the ash, you find a kind of steel inside yourself that wasn't there before. You learn to stop begging people to be loyal and start demanding it. You stop handing out endless chances, and you start valuing yourself as the prize. I learned that loyalty isn't just about staying true to someone else. It's about staying true to yourself. And betrayal? Betrayal is nothing more than someone showing you who they really are. The cruelest part is believing the mask for so long. But the gift, if you can call it that, is finally seeing the truth. As for them, the consequences kept unfolding slowly, painfully, as I knew they would. Ethan's career never recovered. The HR investigation clipped his wings. He wasn't fired outright, not immediately, but his reputation took hit after hit. Clients didn't trust him, co-workers whispered, and soon enough he was transferred out of the big projects into small, meaningless assignments. The man who once walked into rooms with easy charm now carried the look of someone bracing for another blow. Last I heard, he left the firm altogether, trying to start fresh somewhere else. But word travels. Credibility is harder to rebuild than a resume. My mother, Caroline, fared no better. If Ethan lost his career, she lost her kingdom. The social circle that once orbited her began to fracture. Friends who had once called her for advice stopped returning her invitations. Neighbors who used to linger in her driveway for chatter now smiled politely and kept walking. The bridge club she loved so much? She quit before they could edge her out completely, but everyone knew why. It wasn't that people were cruel. It was that she had fed so long on admiration that when it dried up, she starved. And that, in a way, was her downfall. I didn't gloat. I didn't rub salt in their wounds. That wasn't the point. The point was simply this: they thought they could hurt me, erase me, and still thrive. They were wrong. And me? I started to thrive. It wasn't overnight. Healing never is. But slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt myself. I reconnected with friends I had shut out during my spiral. I poured myself into work, not as an escape, but as a declaration that I was capable, talented, and worthy of building something on my own. I started traveling, taking small weekend trips, letting myself taste joy in new places, with no shadow following me. The biggest change was internal. I carried myself differently. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped lowering my standards in the hope that people would love me more. I realized I didn't need love that came with conditions. I only needed respect. Looking back now, I see the whole story as a kind of crucible. Betrayal tested me in the ugliest way possible, by ripping open the two relationships that were supposed to be the safest. But revenge, justice, whatever you want to call it, gave me the closure I needed. It let me walk away not as a victim, but as the author of my own ending. So if you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever had the wind knocked out of you by someone you trusted most, let me tell you this: you will get up again. It will hurt, yes. It will leave scars. But scars are proof of survival, and survival is proof of strength. Betrayal doesn't define you, your response does. For me, that response was revenge. For you, it might be healing in a quieter way. Both are valid. What matters is that you never let someone else's betrayal convince you that you are less than you are. Because here's the truth: betrayal doesn't destroy the strong. It forges them. And I am living proof. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button right now. It tells me you felt every beat of this journey. And if you've ever dreamed of serving justice to someone who wronged you, subscribe and ring the bell, because more stories like this are coming. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed, or maybe even pulled off yourself? Was it loud and public or subtle and surgical? Share it. This channel is where we turn pain into power, and your story might give someone else the courage to stand tall. Here's the truth. Most people sit around waiting for karma, like it's some train scheduled to arrive when it feels convenient. But sometimes karma doesn't come on its own. Sometimes you've got to pick it up, sharpen it, and deliver it yourself. That's not cruelty. That's balance. That's reclaiming your voice. And that's exactly what happened here. Betrayal was supposed to leave me broken, but instead, it carved me into someone unshakable. If you've ever felt underestimated, betrayed, or silenced, let this be your reminder. You're not powerless. So, smash like, share this with a friend who needs a little justice in their day, and subscribe for more stories where the underdog doesn't just survive, they win. Because in the end, sometimes the best justice isn't waiting for karma, it's delivering it yourself.